Morning, Dad.
Morning.
Um, Being as I would normally come back in the summer and not coming back this year, I had planned to interview you and record some of the sort of stories around key events in my life that I remember, and some that I remember from the stories you tell that aren't actually memories of mine. And the first one is before I was born, and it's a story about how you moved from being a technician for the GPO originally to becoming a telecom sales guy. So I remember being told the story that after moving down to Bristol, that you initially weren't particularly successful at all as a salesman, and it's a new area, obviously a new scope of work. You knew the product and you knew the customers, but you'd never sold it before. So, but there was a thing that happened, which I want you to talk through, and then that led to you having some success afterwards.
Yes, indeed it did. At the beginning of 1978, I got this job down in Bristol, and the idea was to sell 3, 4, or 5 large systems, large telephone systems, and my territory, the western region of my territory, which was counties like Cornwall, Devon, Wiltshire, and places like that, really hadn't produced hardly any business before, less than 100,000. And I got this target for the first year, which was a bit of a surprise, of £350,000.
No one had
Anyway,
sold a telephone system down there before.
no, it was dead territory. It was dead territory. Anyway, so I took over a couple of orders, which all I had to do was keep them warm, and they eventually turned into orders. But I wasn't really doing any selling. And then, as we got towards the end of the year, Dick said to me, "You're going to be in trouble if you don't reach your target by the end of the year." And as the man said, I got on my bike and I scratched my head, and I, I mean, basically, I drove to places and saw people like Cornwall County Council and all sorts of companies, Wrigley's, the Spearmint Company down in Plymouth, and so on and so forth. It didn't work. And things were getting closer and closer. And then I was remembered from my old GPO days. There was a company called Eli Lilly, the chemical company in Basingstoke. And what triggered in my mind, I thought I knew somebody there. So I checked him out and I went and saw the telecoms director of Eli Lilly Europe, who was based there. And he had a telephone system requirement. And I mean, this was after a lot of hard work, so you need a bit of luck. But anyway, he said he would give me the order, and things were getting closer and closer to Christmas. And I phoned him up. I said, "Can you give me an order before Christmas?" And he said, "Oh, that will take a time to progress." I said, "Can you give me a letter of intent?" And the fact is, the letter of intent came in over the telex, because we used telex in those days, came in on the day we were closing the office, which was the day of the office party, and everybody celebrated. Bottles of champagne were open and everything. So that's it.
Went from zero to hero in one day from
Exactly.
from remembering the old contact. And you stayed at STC for some time after that.
Yep. I stayed at STC for the next over 5 years, and each year I made 100% or more, and so I joined the ITT 100 Club, as it was called then, which was a great accolade to have. But the secret was, I think the point about this was that there weren't that many businesses in this whole area, and those businesses that were there, you had to work really hard on. Gus Payne down at Western Helicopters, they had a requirement for a very large system, and I stuck to Gus Payne like glue. I went everywhere with him. And him and the company secretary of Western Helicopters, I eventually got an order some years later, after I was already achieving year on year. I eventually got an order from him, and it was virtually £1 million for this telephone system at Western Helicopters. And
You had to
nobody
stick to him for 2 or 3 years beforehand.
I did. I stick to it. I mean, I was doing other business for people like Cullen Laboratories and got other orders, the Babycham company, Showerings, and people like that. But the point is that by sticking to this guy like glue, I could watch every twist and turn, because ultimately they were all going to sit in the boardroom and decide who's going to get the order. And we were up against IBM all the time. IBM had an IBM system called 3750, and we had a thing called a Unimat 4080. And IBM were absolutely furious at us in the West Country, because we just got every big order in the whole territory.
But I think I remember you saying that the IBM technology itself was probably better, but they didn't have the relationships or the sales team to get it out there.
Well, I think the problem they had, and of course it's different these days, because telecoms and IT, computer responsibility is all under one head now. But in those days, right at the top of most companies, you had a telecoms head and you had a computing systems head. And of course, like at Western Helicopters, wherever they were, in the boardrooms and in the management teams, there was this argument going on between the computing guy who wanted IBM, and if we played our cards right and did the work, with the telecoms guy. But I think the secret was that I had, once I'd started to get orders down in the West Country, I had that sort of 18 months or so before any of the other big boys woke up to this. Because they didn't think there were any orders down there either. It wasn't just our company. But once they got to know of this, it was daggers drawn on it. It was battleground.
I guess you would have known some of the competitors. Your equivalent down there in the West Country must have appeared at some point in time.
Oh yeah, and those IBM guys were really smooth guys. They were so cool. I mean, but I think the problem was that well, the art of it really was to dig yourself in with the telecoms guy first. If you didn't do that, you got nowhere near getting the order anyway. And I think that it's just basically hard work, because I was no good at cold calling or anything like that. I had to find ways of getting to these people without fighting my way through the receptionist and the PA and all those sorts of things. It was all sort of, you had to think about it a lot, how you could get to the guys. Well, luckily enough, everybody thought that I was a fantastic salesman, which really in real terms, if you compare it to true hardened salesmen who do it for 30 or 40 years or whatever, no, I wasn't the most brilliant of guys, but I just worked out how to do it, basically.
So you had a good 5+ years at STC, and then when I was about, which is what I know, is that when I was about 5 or 6, we moved to Sussex, and you left STC and started Phone Consult Limited, PCL. So what happened, and why did you start PCL?
Well, if you were doing a proper management analysis, you come up with the conclusion I started PCL for all the wrong reasons. STC ITT, I'd been offered a job down in Brighton, working for STC ITT and their international department, and again, I'd been offered the job, so you take it. So we were moved to Sussex. But sadly, what those guys, even at senior director level locally and in the UK, didn't know what was going on, is that the ITT company internationally were making a massive reorganization. Why? Nobody will really understand why. Nobody can understand it. They were divesting themselves of all sorts of parts of telecoms, and they decided to close the operation in Brighton. So they said to me, well, you can move up to North London. We've got a big office up there. And I thought, no way, I'm going to move my family again. You forget that. And so I decided to leave the company. I took an interim job for a short while, which was the Marshall Telephone Company in London. And whilst I was doing that, I was working out who I could get to work with me. And I decided to set up the company based in Lewes.
Sorry, just a break, because I remember you telling me about this, and I couldn't actually remember where it fitted in. But Marshall was the odd guy that used to have the management meetings at his house. Is that right, in London?
Yeah, absolutely bonkers, this guy, crazy guy. He had a beautiful executive apartment just off Pall Mall, off Pall Mall, in that St James's area. And his chauffeur would drive him up in the Rolls Royce so that he would be able to, shower and get ready for the day up there. And then he would have had his breakfast and so forth. And we'd have to be there for a meeting, say at 8 o'clock, 8 a.m. in the morning, which, it's quite a stretch to make sure that you're all ready, tickety-boo, ready for a meeting at 8 o'clock in the morning. Anyway, he would use this opportunity. He was a bit like Trump. He'd just pontificate about things. And he'd come up with massively crazy ideas. But it was interesting because it took me away from the big company environment, which I've been in all the time. And as part of that, I made connections with people who might be able to work with me. I made connections in Ireland and around the country, around the UK. It was very interesting. Obviously, Marshall was such a guy you could never work with him long term because his mood or situation would change within the day, just like Trump's does. And he had enormous confidence in himself. And he said, "Oh, you just go and see the director of a post office telephones, or BT had become by then, and he'll do whatever you like for me." And of course, that absolutely wasn't true. But anyway, it was an interim job. It was very interesting. Met lots of people, and made some contacts. And whilst all this was going on, I was setting up the company based in Lewes at number 85A High Street, Lewes. And I was also had been working out what I should do, and there were two products which I'd negotiated deals on. One was a desktop telecoms cum computer device to compete with the IBM. IBM a couple of years before had brought out their first desktop computer. One was like that, but also had lots of telecoms connections directly, which you could plug into the device itself. It was brilliant. And that was called the Mitel Contact.
I remember. Yeah.
You remember that?
Yeah, I remember the Mitel Contact.
It was massively successful. It was not massively successful. It was a superb product and really did work. The trouble is, it was before its time. And at the same time, I was negotiating with my old employer, STC, about a terminal they developed in North London, which was called the Executel, which was a similar sort of product. With both of these products, we made sales, but the companies were all over the show in terms of strategy, and both of them pulled the plug on these things, which then left PCL with a bit of a problem, because we thought we were moving into a new era, which later on in my dissertation at the university I wrote about remote working. We thought we were moving into a new era. Now that door was closed, and so head scratching time. And what happened is I basically got on my bike or got on the train and went to see some of my old contacts. And I was amazed to find there were massive contracts being let in London and, well, nationally, for new infrastructure cabling for computers and telecoms. Massive contracts. And I mean, perhaps it wouldn't happen these days, but I got a contract from the BBC from my old friend Ron Renton.
There's two I remember, which Citicorp and the BBC were two of the big ones.
Yeah.
But the point is, I mean, for me, and the point is that the starting PCL was I guess a little bit focused on what the good technology is, that you would find it quite easy to sell. And even now, sort of 35 years later, you're still quite animated when you talk about the Mitel contact.
I am.
But I mean, it was good technology. But then when they stopped building it, you had to go and ask around to see what it is that people were buying, and it's a completely different direction. You know, they've started with what it is that's good to sell, but actually the success came when you looked at what it is that people were contracting for.
Yeah, absolutely. And the concept with the Mitel and the SDC terminals was simply to be able to operate a relatively low-key business with no staff, and one would make sales with those products. So there was no other services you required in the company. And I don't know if those companies hadn't have pulled out, we might have carried on and moved on. I can't really tell, but there wasn't a choice because they pulled out. So getting on your bike or getting on the train and going to see previous contacts in London. But I was amazed how quickly these people had confidence in me, and we got orders, as I say, to BBC, and you've mentioned Citibank. And the strange thing was with Citibank was that they needed somebody to help them. They were struggling with what was required, because in those days you had to have separate computer cabling for each type of IBM computer systems, because they were building new dealing floors in London.
Wow.
Not only different types of IBM, they had different types of cabling for Apple machines. There was Apple Talk networks, and there was machines for the...
What's an Apple Talk network? I don't remember that.
Well, it's interesting. The Apple Talk network was how Apple devised a method by which any Apple computer could transfer information to any other Apple computer, provided they were connected in terms of a network. And they had their own kind of concept of a network, but it required special cabling for Apple. You couldn't have a central server sitting in your riser in the building, connect every different type of computer to that. It had to be all separate. So when we kitted out the Citibank, we had networks for DEC computers. I know we don't hear of those anymore. We had networks for DEC computers, networks for two types of IBM systems, an Apple Talk network. And the big thing for us was the new structured cabling network, which came out from AT&T, using category standard cable for the first time. And we installed that as well.
So nowadays, everyone's familiar. They probably have a Cat6 or Cat5 if they're a bit older, cables in their office, and they plug into the back of everything. Doesn't matter what type of device it is. But then everything had its own different, basically, cable and termination point. So amazing.
Amazing. And interestingly enough, it was category 3 at that time that we were installing. interesting enough, over the period of time of Citibank operating, and they're still there now on the south side by London Bridge, these other cable systems were made redundant, and they went over to using what effectively is what you're talking about now. Amazing, really.
Something happened something happened sort of on a macro scale with the economy, and also because of these large projects, which brought the sort of the PCL thing to an end. Because I mean, I was 10 or 11 years old. I don't remember the sequence. Some parts of it, like Jonathan staying with us, felt like 6 months, and it was probably only 6 weeks. And other parts of it, like choosing the car that CERTI gave you an allowance for, felt like it took 2 days, but probably took 5 weeks. So tell me remind me the sequence of events and what happened.
Well, what we didn't know, none of us, any business knew, that we were creeping up to massive inflation in the late 1980s, massive inflation. By 1989, Lawson, the then Chancellor, put up the interest rates, because he controlled directly the Bank of England then, put up the interest rates to 15%. So businesses might be paying a whole lot more than that just for an overdraft. 15%, we're paying 18, 19, 20, 22%. And all of this crept up on everybody. And of course, we were using an overdraft. We didn't have capital at the beginning. We were still using an overdraft to fund all these projects. Well, when interest rates are running at 6 or 7%, it's not so bad. But when interest rates get higher and higher, your exposure is higher. And so the banks started to move it.
And it's not just the interest on the loan for the business, it's the interest on the loan for mortgage. How high did the interest rate go for the overdraft?
Oh, I think it went over 20%. I can't remember the exact.
Right.
I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. I mean, what I was seeing was businesses collapsing all over the place. I mean, you wouldn't believe it. The business people would go. A local guy who lived down in Brighton, really professional company who we'd work with on fitting out the buildings at places like Citicorp, etc. The bank didn't even give him 24 hours. They just came in, closed his account down, took his house away, and literally came and took his car away. And that was it. He had nothing. And his wife and children had to go to the council to try and find accommodation. It was ruthless. So what was happening in 89 is that things had got to such a heated level that the banks were just closing everything down that they could find, and they put pressure on us. But fortunately, in a way, we saw this coming, and Jonathan Solomons was with us for at least 6 months, not a few weeks. He was with us a long time. And thanks to his good accounting and financial management, we staved off the bank, Lloyds Bank. We staved them off long enough to be able to try and put the company up for sale. And in fact, Jonathan himself was part of the plan. We weren't going to put our name on any prospectus or anything like that. The competition would have loved that.
Yeah.
So we did a no-name prospectus. Jonathan sent it out from his own personal address in London, and then I met the people who were interested in the company, and there were quite a few.
Because the thing is, the interest rates and whatever were tough, but the business was still actively running and fulfilling these contracts and trying to win new contracts, right? And that's why you didn't want to. Yeah. That's why you didn't want to say that you were for sale.
That's right. I mean, at this time, while all this was going on, we were cabling out the North Terminal of Gatwick. I mean, everywhere you walk in North Terminal of Gatwick, it's got all our computer and telecoms cabling in it.
But it's amazing that, you know, effectively the pressure was being put on by the bank, but on the other side of it, if they actually understood the business, this was one of the biggest contracts in Southeast England that you were fulfilling at the time.
Yeah,
And
they didn't understand the business at all. The guy who was a regional director of the bank, of Lloyd's Bank, I don't know what his background was, but he understood nothing about our business or business in general. But anyway, he'd been given the job of closing in on these companies. Anyway, he got very upset with us because just as he was, you know, tightening the screw, we signed a deal with a company called NG Bailey, an electrical company in the north of England, who had massive capital. That was the way they survived through these things, because they had owned lots and lots of property. I think they'd started life back in the Victorian era. The company itself, massively, you know, well established over years. And I'd met them at the Rugby Club of London, our clandestine sort of place where I met people, still not revealing the name of the company, had negotiation. And finally we clinched this deal. And you saw these guys at the Lloyd's Bank, their faces went white. They couldn't believe that I'd escaped from their clutches.
Well, probably very few other people had done, because
there were so many.
Was too great.
There were so many companies going under. People don't know these days, but that period, which eventually led to the recession of 1991-92, was carnage. I mean, it was just carnage. I mean, Lawson was raising these interest rates all the time. He joined the European Monetary Union, the EMU, and then he decided to come out a few months later. So confidence in the UK just collapsed. What happened was that the NG Bailey wanted to move everything, the whole of the PCL operations, up to North London, to Boreham Wood. And I wasn't going to go up there. George did, my brother, he went up there, but I decided that was it. And Certi, who for conveniently this Italian infrastructure company again, were conveniently basing themselves in Tunbridge Wells, which I could drive to. And again, I realized it was only going to be short term, but it was very interesting. The Italian guy, I can't remember his name, but he was classically, your Italian mafia type.
Stories about this suave Italian guy that wasn't particularly productive business-wise, but was pretty cool.
He was definitely cool. And in fact, you know, again, he was a bit Trump-like. He'd come up with all sorts of ideas. And he wanted the grounds of this office reshaped to make them look even more grand than they were. And so I was charged with finding an artist stroke landscape architect to actually carry out these works. And I think the piece of grey marble, which the company name was inscribed in, cost them about £12,000 on its own. But he loved it. Crazy company. So that was fine. I wasn't going to hang around there too long. But again, you met contacts and met people. I wanted to move on to something else.
When did you, again, like, I can't remember exactly when it was, but there was a period when you were at home mostly, and I think it was when you were doing your MSc. Where did that fit in?
Well, that was again just after Certi.
Okay.
I decided that because I'd come across all sorts of, how could I say, principles of management, development of projects, how to organize companies, how teams worked. I'd come across all of these sorts of things, or experienced the problems and the difficulties of doing all these things. And And I thought, I've got to find out what's the real hard academic knowledge behind all this. What other people are experiencing. And I just looked into the possibility of doing a degree, and I went to the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex, and passed an examination to join them.
You had to do it because you left school very early when you were younger. Yeah.
Yeah. I had no first degree. I just was originally an apprentice, and I thought I was going to do a diploma in the management of technology, but it ended up me doing a master's degree. And really, this was the time when the scales were falling from my eyes. I was actually understanding what was behind all of the things that I had experienced in my working life. What was behind all these things, and I shall never forget that period. Absolutely amazing period. But what it meant to say, I was part-time working and part-time doing this degree, and so I was home again. Of course, not home again. I was staying at home. But I had to go off and do some work to earn some money, and that's when I went to work for people like Schrack in Austria. I did a few little investigations for them. I worked for the telephone manufacturing company of South Africa. I went to South Africa. That was a very interesting trip because that was at the time that apartheid was being was coming to an end. So I did all these like consultancy jobs for these different companies whilst I was doing this degree, and it was just a question of getting some money coming in through the door so I could do this degree. I mean, the main focus was degree, and by golly, it really was, just what I wanted, and I should never forget it.
And then to my memory, once you got the MSc, and I remember 500 million drafts of the dissertation around the house, and everyone that knew us had to. You've probably got one on the shelf behind you somewhere.
Yeah.
Oh, there it is. Eventually, but there was a lot of editing of that and proofreading that went in. After that, you went to Ericsson, and then a version of Ericsson, Demovo. Is that right?
Yeah. Again, I mean, these are all things that sort of, I don't know what people thought I was doing, but I was obviously reasonably well known in the telecoms business. And I got a phone call from Ericsson one day by one of my contacts, and he said to me, could you come and do some work for Ericsson, because we've got a problem project. And so went over to see the managing director of Ericsson Business Systems. Fortunately, they were based in Burgess Hill in Sussex, so it was a real easy job for me to go and see them. So when I got over there, I found that their problem that they had was that they'd installed a telephone system for the BBC in Broadcasting House in London, and on the day they switched it over, the Director General's phone didn't work. Now, and I mean, it was an absolute disaster. It was an unmitigated disaster. And so what they were trying to do, I could see what their plan was. Let's get somebody in from outside, put him in charge of this project, and if it all goes wrong, it's his fault. If it goes right,
yeah,
we can all claim credit. So very interesting.
Quite ironic because, 4 years before, PCL was cabling the BBC.
Yes, yeah. Because I knew the guy, same bloke, Ron Renton. So I went up to see Ron Renton at the BBC and said, I've been asked to try and sort these problems out. And so he took me through all of the problems, and it was an absolute disaster. Ericsson installed by this time telephone systems are computer operated and all that sort of stuff. And they had massive software problems on this system. And there were about 5,000 telephones, all in some state of not working. So it was a sort of like 24-hour-a-day job to sort this out. And I eventually went to Sweden, and this is where these telephone systems are being designed and made. And I eventually, it was like being a detective, I eventually found the two guys that wrote the software for this product. And there were two little gnomes who crept out of a little dacha somewhere in the woods. And I had real trouble getting to see them. Nobody wanted to let me talk to them or anything like that. You know, no, we'll send another software patch and all this. And I said, no, we're not accepting anything like that. I want to talk to the man who writes the software. Anyway, I got these two little gnomes in the room, and I was flanked by all sorts of managers from Ericsson who were dead nervous. And I said to these two guys, it's not working, is it? Doing all these patches, it's not working. I said, basically, what I want you to do is rewrite the whole software from scratch without any patches. And of course, everybody nearly collapsed in the room, you know. So, but cut a long story short, these two little gnomes came over from Sweden, and they brought their terminals with them and everything like that, and they worked, as far as I could see, worked 24 hours a day. They were amazing. And they rewrote the whole of the software for this system at BBC. And after 3 months, I could walk away from that and say, job done. Fantastic.
And you stayed at Ericsson for quite a while after that, or Ericsson and Demovo, doing different project
Ericsson jobs. And then Demovo, and again, it was another difficult job. For this time for GPRS, which is the forerunner of the technology that keeps smartphones running. GPRS, forerunner of 4G and 5G, was being installed as a pilot system for Vodafone in the UK. And it was not working. So who do they call on? Vic Yent. So this time, I go to a meeting in the headquarters of Ericsson in Guildford, and I walk into this room, and there must have been 30 people in the room, 30 managers. And I thought, oh my God, what am I walking into here? And they were all waiting for me basically to say yes. Another situation. Send Vic Yent up there. And if it doesn't work, we can fire him and blame him. If it does work, we'll all claim the credit. But the guy who I really liked and it was on the same page was the global GPRS director of Ericsson, a guy called Bjorn Samuelsson. And if it hadn't been for him being there, I would have never have taken the job. I had confidence in that guy, and he wanted people, he wanted can-do people, and I became one of his can-do people.
There's a lot of, I mean, a lot of the people I remember, because it was when I was a teenager, were were the people at Ericsson, like Stuart, and of course Hans, who we met more recently in Indonesia, who ran as president a number of countries for Ericsson. And a guy I don't think I ever met, Julian Ferrari, was he at Ericsson as well?
Yes, wonderful guy, wonderful guy. Julian Ferrari, he was a salesman, a real one. And I met him at Ericsson. Yeah.
So there are all these people, there are all these people around. But it wasn't, I mean, I remember that it wasn't always particularly easy, and mainly for sort of internal or external political reasons. What were the hardest things to deal with there?
Well, let's go back to Ericsson in the Vodafone. Vodafone headquarters in Newbury and Berkshire. and I was up there running this, and the project began to be a success. And the biggest problem I had was literally everybody wanting to take over the job, and I hadn't even, I mean, it was becoming a success, but I hadn't even sort of got it to the final success point where I could hand it over, and they all wanted to take it over. And I mean, I had to drive to the Ericsson headquarters one day, and I had to lay the law down to the guy who was one of the directors. I said, you've got to get these people off my back, because if you don't get them off my back, I'm going to go, and you'll find that this will all fall apart. We're not ready yet. Just get them off my back. That took about 3 or 4 months, when there was a lot of political nastiness going on in the company, and that was my first, you know, if you like, from a big corporation point of view, that was the first period when I realized how devious and how backstabbing and whatever else you can think of, and you thought, how could that go on an Ericsson? Ericsson's a very sort of social democratic company and all that sort of thing, but by golly, the British guys in the UK here were full of it, and it was an awful time. And because of that, when I got this project working, and when we started to work on the 3G and 4G stuff, I decided to pull out. Anyway, I didn't want to be living all the time at Newbury, but because of those politics, I pulled out.
Okay, so the last one is sort of, I guess it's a bit more general. Dad, you've always been very supportive of me, but I also know from the people that have worked for you and worked with you, and that you've worked for as well, have always stay in touch and stay close to you, and you're, as far as I know, you've always been very supportive as a boss, but you're also quite single-minded when you want to put about doing something. So what are these? How do you put together these characteristics? Because to getting the teams to work together, but also trying to be focused on getting things done, because they don't marry perfectly all the time.
No, they don't. I think the teams aspect of things is in whether all the people are in the one company, or whether it's a team being made up of people from different companies. The team is the key thing. It really is the key thing. And it was tough. And going back to that Vodafone situation, I thought that the only way it was going to be a success is if the design engineers all worked as a team. And basically, they were a load of prima donnas, and it was going to be tough. So I operated on the basis that I respected their technical competence and so on and so forth, but what I drummed into them in the nicest possible way, but firmly, is the question of deliverables. That you had to have a deliverable, and I broke down the whole project into very small deliverables into each stage, and I focused these guys on that. I brought together Vodafone engineers, external engineers from Cisco and other companies, and the Ericsson engineers, and basically by giving them very small work packages and by setting them time scales which were like just a week long to do these things, we eventually made it succeed. But you really have to work at it. I mean, one of the things that I operated, because we were all spread all over the place, not just in the UK, but in Norway, Sweden, and other places, including Greece, where we were doing something for Vodafone over there. I operated very simple process, and that was management by walking about, MBWA. And that you can find out a lot what's going on. And that's what my dad did when he was a manager with the post office telephones. And I took a lot of stuff. Sorry,
Yeah,
carry on.
you mean when you say management by walking about? Because I don't. You've been saying this to me for 30 years. It's 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 going around and seeing what everyone's doing, trying to understand what their job is, what that specific thing is. Before you coined the phrase management by walking around, you used to comment whenever you thought something was inefficient. You used to say they should do a time and motion study on that.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Which is the same sort of thing. It's to understand what that thing is and part of the process. Yeah.
But I think the key thing about it is that was to always act professionally and to resist the when things are getting tough, to resist the possibility of there might be arguments in the office or with whoever it is or whatever. If those sorts of things were going to be done where you had to talk tough, then you had to bite the bullet and speak to the person individually in private, not in front of everybody else. And I think that, yeah, I am single-minded, but I think the people who act like a Red Adair, who are problem solvers, have to be to some extent single-minded. We're not backroom people. I'd never be a backroom person. You have to be single-minded, but I think the combination of being focused and transmitting the reasons why you need to be focused to all the people in the team, I think is a key thing. Like winning their support. I think you can't just say to me, like I was talking about work packages. You can't just say do that work package. You have to explain to them why you're doing that work package. You have to explain to them the roadmap to success, and you have to enthuse people. I mean, for instance, you know, other projects, I always had little points in the time where we celebrated things. I always built people up and thanked the engineer for doing an excellent job and whatever it was. So you're kind of always doing that sort of thing, but nevertheless being focused on and keeping this roadmap in everybody's mind. I think that was the key thing.
You've been a manager for most, well, all of the time I've sort of been grown up since I was 5 years old. But you've had different bosses from when you started work when you were 16, 17, all the way through to, you know, those guys at Ericsson and Vodafone. Is there anyone that sticks out as a particularly good or different boss?
Well, I mentioned this guy, Bjorn Samuelson, marvelous guy. I'm still friends with him now. Still chat to him on LinkedIn. Marvelous guy. I think the other guy I mentioned as the reason why we moved down to Bristol, Dick McLeod, marvelous guy. He said to me, going back to the salesman thing, he said to me, we were in the pub, which was often his meeting place. He couldn't do that these days, but he said to me in the pub, he said, listen, Vic, I don't care if you play golf all day, every week, as long as those orders come in. And he was like that. He was a really great guy. He was totally hands off. Yeah. You know, do whatever you want to do. And this makes you begin to think for yourself. He was a great guy. But if I go right back to the days just after I left the GPO telephones, so when I went to work for GEC in Coventry, to go right back to those days, the guy who interviewed me and was my mentor in those early days was the chap called Peter Sawyer. He was the head of GEC public telephone systems contracting department. He was a pretty big shot guy. And I think he was a wonderful guy, a calm, clear guy, and he supported me on a number of different occasions whilst I was in that job up at Coventry. So he's one of my top people. Bjorn Samuelson, Peter Sawyer from years ago, Dick McLeod, and other people I've worked with who I think are great guys. Hans Josef Bruggen, you know, really like working with him. He was the guy that got me to go to Algeria. And even one of my old schoolboy friends, school days friends, Colin Mitchell, who was a regional director in Ericsson. He was the reason why I went to Ireland to sort out the problems over there. So these are all the people I put in my stable and think of fondly.